In 1914, a 19-year-old German volunteered for military service, and 4 years later he was awarded Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite. But almost all his comrades had fallen. He turned his experience into a memoir that became one of Hitler's favorite books. Yet, decades later, the same author was regarded as one of Europe's wisest intellectuals. This is not fiction. This is the life of Ernst Jünger. Today we're discussing The Storm of Steel, a book that is far more than a war memoir. It poses a troubling question. How should we read a writer who depicts violence aesthetically rather than condemning it? This book is neither anti-war nor pro-war. It is something more complex and more dangerous, an experiment that turns violence into experience. Moreover, by focusing on Junger's experiences, we can reopen hidden fissures in 20th century history. How did ideological propaganda shape wartime society? How did protest and coexistence occur in the trenches? And how did state power expand and resistance leave a glimmer of hope? And does a certain posture of aestheticizing violence reappear in new forms in our lives today? So here are three portraits of Junger at different ages. From left to right is his young age in German form, middle age, and then the old age. So you may wonder, what is war, what is violence, and what is aesthetics? So based on Junger's textual stance, The Storm of Steel is based on the diaries Junger kept on the Western Front between 1915 and 1918. The narrator rises from a simple rifleman to a stormtroop commander, experiencing the bloodiest battles of Verdun and the Somme. The first edition was privately printed in 1920, making it one of the earliest personal accounts of the Great War to be published. But what makes The Storm of Steel remarkable is not only its historical detail, it is its unique narrative stance. The Encyclopedia Britannica puts it succinctly. Junger describes his experiences of bravery and suffering on the Western Front in a detached, matter-of-fact tone. Note the keywords detached and matter-of-fact. What does this tone imply? Just as what the opening scene said on 28 December 1914. I joined the 73rd Hanoverian Fusilier Regiment as a volunteer. No patriotic fanfares, no grand historical narrative, no questioning of war's meaning, just a soldier's cool record. This narrative strategy gives The Storm of Steel the quality of clinical report. War is presented as a phenomenon that can be observed, recorded, and experienced, not as an object of judgment. One revealing detail captures the essence of this narrative. When Junger sees German soldiers wearing steel helmets for the first time in the trenches, he writes, that was the beginning of a more brutal phase of the war. War is not firstly described as terrible or just through moral rhetoric. It is marked empirically by a material symbol, the steel helmet, as a more brutal phase. By using such material signifiers, war sheds all external interpretations and reverts to a pure phenomenon. Critics often note that death is handled with unusual conciseness in The Storm of Steel. The writer David Frum observes, when death comes in A Storm of Steel, it comes quickly and cleanly. Even the most horrific moment Junger ever experienced, a shell landing right in the middle of his company, is dismissed in a sentence or two. This narrative rhythm is not cold-heartedness, it is a deliberate technique. Literary scholars point out that Junger does not endow war with meaning in ideological terms, but does so indirectly through a highly metaphorical language. When both armies are described with the same symbolic imagery, their opposition dissolves. This is not ideological neutrality. It is a deeper aesthetic stance. War is recorded as a primal force that transcends friend and foe as well as moral judgment. After the war, Junger wrote extensively about turning war into inner experience. For example, in Battle as Inner Experience, he wrote, "Battle binds men together, inactivity separates them." This philosophical reflection, linking war with the vitality of life, is the aesthetic consequence of his narrative. War becomes no longer an event that can be supported or condemned, but a primal force to be experienced and sublimated. Yet avoiding judgment is itself a stance. When Younger describes himself as always sensitive to such things, for instance, feeling uncomfortable at the sight of a driver's injured finger on the way to the front, he simultaneously admits that the battlefield desensitized one to suffering. This self-observation reveals a disturbing psychological mechanism. Violence is experienced as something that can be tamed, adapted to, and even aestheticized. The storm of steel does not exist in a vacuum. To truly understand its meaning, we must place it in the overall historical context of the First World War, a time when ideology, state power, and popular protest were fiercely interwoven. Here shows German World War I propaganda poster and newspaper. During World War I, Germany deployed a highly systematic propaganda machine. Kaiser II framed the war as a defensive necessity, declaring, "We have no interest in seizing other countries, but with unwavering will we shall defend the territory God has given us." This narrative resonated with the widespread nationalism and social Darwinism of German society at the time. War was depicted as inevitable, even legitimate, as a form of national struggle. So, under this ideology, the soldier was molded as an agent of nation, and war was portrayed as the embodiment of a struggle for existence. The book largely conforms to this framework. Younger almost never asks why did Germany go to war, and shows striking indifference to decision making, political background, and diplomatic structures. This refusal to question is itself a political choice. Yet, the battlefield was never monolithic. In the trenches, many soldiers experienced a gap between official propaganda and their own reality. In 1917, the French army experienced mutiny that affected nearly half of the divisions, soldiers refusing orders to launch senseless, costly attacks. On the Western Front and even Eastern Front, Russian and Austro-Hungarian soldiers increasingly fell into a live and let live pattern, sometimes even laying down arms to celebrate holidays together. These events show that ideological obedience was never absolute. In real, specific trenches, the human instinct for survival, exhaustion, loneliness, and mutual sympathy often overwhelmed the grand narratives of the nation state, and Junger largely bypasses these experiences. In his narrative, soldiers are either fighters or the fallen, rarely appearing as thinking human beings who protest or mock propaganda. This is a blind spot in his writing. And next, the dimension of state power. During World War I, the German Empire expanded its war powers under the guise of a state of exception, suppressing strikes, anti-war protests, and any talk of internal dissolution with unprecedented severity. In the face of such a state apparatus, resistance and obedience existed in a tense equilibrium. Zhonghe remains silent here as well. His heroic narrative ironically reinforces the image of a soldier as unconditionally obedient to the nation, without questioning the limits or abuses of the power. The best way to grasp the uniqueness of the Storm of Steel is to compare it with another classic from the same era, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Remarque's novel emphatically rejects war, presenting it as a force of dehumanization and moral destruction. The soldier Paul Boehmer loses all his ideas and finally falls on a quiet afternoon. The title is very ironic. Remarque's narrative is filled with accusatory descriptions of graphic violence. However, genre is different. He does not deny the cruelty of war, but he chooses not to make it an object of accusation. In The Storm of Steel, death is quick and clean. Will Remarque shows a man's back torn open in his pink lines painting, Jonger simply describes a massive bombardment as thousands of shafts of fire turning the western horizon into a sea of flowers. A sea of flowers. From here grows the aestheticization of violence. Together, these two works constitute the two dominant cultural narratives of the Great War in the 20th century. Their difference lies not in the factual depiction, but in a fundamental disagreement over what does war mean. For Younger, war is something that can be experienced, sublimated, and even revitalizing. However, for Remarque, war is destruction that cannot be aestheticized. Younger remained one of the most complex figures in his time. In the 1920s, he was seen as leading voice of new nationalism, advocating an anti-democratic worker state based on military discipline, order, and sacrifice. Some of these ideas arguably fertilized the soil of extreme nationalism. But when Nazis came to power, Junger rejected Hitler's overtures. He forbade Goebbels from using his work for propaganda and began writing allegorical novels such as On the Marble Cliffs, which implicitly criticized tyranny. The Gestapo searched his Berlin apartment as well, regarding him as an unreliable element. Just as the subtitle said from The Spectator, a man who could describe battlefield horrors in aestheticized language and barely comment on starving enemy civilians, yet felt revulsion at the Nazist elimination of weak. This tension is deeply perplexing. Some historians still argue that early works like The Storm of Steel paved the way to some degree for a fascist aesthetic of violence in far-right culture. Longer himself never became a doctrinarian pacifist. What he left behind is not a political statement, but a phenomenological record of a war, a raw document of how a soldier perceived, experienced, and digested extreme violence. So finally, the real value of the Storm of Steel is not that it supports or opposes war, but that it refuses to understand war through any pre-existing framework. Younger presents war as a phenomenon, something that can be perceived, recorded, and experienced, yet cannot be simply placed in the category of good or evil. But we must be aware of the risks inherent in such a narrative. When violence is aestheticized, when death is turned into experience, and when war is encoded as a metaphor, all of this can lead to a suspension of moral judgment. So finally, when war becomes an aesthetic object, humanity stands at its post-perilous moment.